Order. Order. Mr. Paul Scully to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Evans, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 116762 relating to the government's EU referendum leaflet. This petition that remains topical has had 219,535 signatures of a few hours ago.
My honourable thing give way.
I will indeed.
The figure is now 219,553 and rising.
Thank you very much for those for bringing to my attention those extra 20 people who've been galvanised by the thought of this debate to this afternoon. I want to read the whole of the prayer of the petition into Hansard. It says, "Stop Cameron spending British taxpayers' money on pro-EU referendum leaflets." Prime Minister David Cameron plans to spend British taxpayers' money on a pro-EU document to be sent to every household in the United Kingdom in the run-up to the EU referendum. We believe voters deserve a fair referendum without taxpayer-funded, biased interceptions by the government. We, the petitioners, demand that the government stops spending our money on biased campaigning to keep Britain inside the European Union. The great British public have waited since 1975 for a vote on our relationship with Brussels. No taxpayers' money should be spent on campaign literature to keep Britain inside the EU. I will indeed.
I'm very grateful. Would you agree that the Prime Minister could have learned something from Harold Wilson, who at that time gave not only a free vote, but also the information which was circulated made both cases equally?
I absolutely agree with the Honourable Lady. It's very important, as you'll see, as my argument develops, that we have a fair and a free, level playing field for this really, really important decision that we have to make on June the 23rd. Now, when an e-petition reaches 10,000 signatures, the government has to issue a response, which it's done so. I'll read a brief extract, though I'm sure the Minister will expand on this when he responds to the debate at the end. They say, "This is a big decision for the country. The government is determined that the public should be clear on what reforms have been agreed and what EU membership means for the UK. The Referendum Act requires the government to publish reports that set out the outcome of the negotiation of our EU membership and the government's opinion on that outcome, and provide information on rights and obligations in EU law and on examples of countries that do not have EU membership but do have other arrangements with the EU." The leaflet went to households across England between the 11th and the 13th of April. But it's going to Scotland, Wales and Ireland, Northern Ireland, this week to avoid the pre-election purdah rules of last week's election. I will indeed.
You agree with me that we hope it does get there before we disappear into a war. So we'll just hope that...
What can I say to that? Thank you. The total cost of this leaflet and the website and marketing that goes around that is £9.3 million of taxpayers' money. On top of that, the Treasury is publishing documents and the government is continuing propaganda at the top of every gov.uk webpage. Although the key difference, at least for those, is that they're not being posted to every house in hard copy at the expense of that resident that's receiving them. I will.
Asked how much is the budget for the entire campaign that the government is conducting, and I'm just told it's sort of absorbed within other costs. That surely cannot be the case, and it certainly wasn't announced in the budget.
What worries me most about that answer is that the Treasury are actually projecting figures to 2030, but they can't actually answer about questions about budgets now. Slightly of concern to me.
Can't or won't?
Well, some colleagues have encouraged voters to return their leaflets to number 10. But since that will be even more cost to the taxpayer if they did it free post, I haven't followed that advice myself. But as you might have predicted, the publication of the leaflet hasn't been universally welcomed. Jonathan Isaby, Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, said that this is a disgraceful abuse of taxpayers' money. When cash is scarce and budgets are tight, politicians shouldn't be wasting nearly £10 million of our cash on political propaganda. The country is having an important debate about its relationship with the EU, and it's essential that it's held on a level playing field. I will.
He's making an excellent introduction to this debate, and 476 of my constituents in Kettering were so outraged that they've also signed this petition. And isn't the main point that the publication of this leaflet goes against the very British sense of fair play? What we want is a level playing field in this referendum, and the government are trying to stack the odds in their favour.
My honourable friend's absolutely right, and I'm glad that Mr Isby said exactly that it's important that people in the public eye that have the ear of the press express that exact opinion.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yeah, please.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, Mr Evans, because the Taxpayers Alliance are actually neutral in this debate. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind, that they only issued that statement because of the waste of taxpayers' money, and they're not actually taking a side in the referendum itself.
No, absolutely. Absolutely, because as many of these organisations find that their members are split either way. So it's absolutely right that in that sort of situation that they do take a neutral view on the actual question, but that doesn't mean to say that they cannot be unconcerned about this £9.3 million, as Jonathan Isby goes on to say, not government money, taxpayers' money. And he concludes by saying it's deplorable that ministers see fit to use it to try and instruct us how to vote.
Would the honourable gentleman be good now? Of course, he knows that this is in pursuance of a legal duty which was introduced into the House of Lords and then became part of our legislation through ping-pong. Is he also aware, however, that I put down an amendment calling for accuracy and impartiality in relation to that information, and the Minister for Europe, who's here today, said to me, certainly it would be. Now, don't we expect to get a proper answer from him this afternoon?
Well, I'm sure the Minister's heard that, and I do hope that he'll respond in full to the debate at the end. Katie Goes of the Electoral Reform Commission expressed similar concern. Last year, or 2014, after the referendum on the Scottish independence, the Electoral Commission warned the government over taxpayer-funded propaganda, saying that it could give an unfair advantage to one side of the argument.
Isn't this a very easy case that no previous Labour or Conservative government has ever thought it should spend taxpayers' money ahead of a general election promoting government policies in the hope of getting a better result? Isn't that exactly what this is doing, and it's therefore a scandal?
Absolutely, and there's many difficult decisions that we are taking as a government across the 5 years of this Parliament, but we don't need to write in full to every household to explain why we're taking those decisions. That's why the media is there, why websites are there. That's what Parliament is there for, to actually be reported back through the speeches and the debates that we have. You know, from my point of view, I'm not sure it's helping the government's case and that case of Remain anyway, because the contents of the leaflet are likely long going to be since forgotten by the start of the purdah period on the 27th of May. But actually, the £9.3 million price tag will still resonate with voters. I'll happily give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Since he mentions the content of the leaflet, does he find it strange that there is no mention in the leaflet of the existential risk of war and genocide? And does he think that this was due to A, the fact that government hadn't recognised that this risk existed, B, that it did recognise that it existed but was willing to contemplate it, or C, that it's a complete fabrication?
Actually, well, I'll come back at time willing to this situation, but since you mentioned multiple choice, actually, it's actually interesting because with the leaflet, we actually have the website eureferendum.org, and that is going to be, we're told, going to be up all the way through until June the 23rd. The website majors on the pro-Remain propaganda and contains a PDF of the leaflet. It's also got an EU quiz, which I had a go at. Now, I fared quite well at how well I knew the EU. The site actually patted me on the back at the end, saying, you're clearly well informed about the EU. Unfortunately, it's exactly for that reason that I'm going to be voting to leave on June the 23rd. But what worries me is that people less informed will buy the line that disaster will unfold if we leave. Now, surely that can't be the case. A responsible government wouldn't go through the whole process of having a referendum when one of the two results would lead to the UK going to hell in the handcart, would they? I will.
Of the Lisbon Treaty, the then Shadow Foreign Secretary William Hague referred to the red card of national parliaments. He thought he could only ever be invoked on something like the slaughter of the firstborn. Did he think that as this red card was also part of the Prime Minister's deal, that this will be the next threat that is not yet mentioned in the leaflet?
You're absolutely right. The Honourable Lady is absolutely right. And it's interesting that the orange card in the Lisbon Treaty has been replacing by the red card in the reforms that have been secured by the Prime Minister, which actually sets a higher bar of reversing or rejecting EU legislation, proposed legislation. Back in February, as we've heard, the Prime Minister ruled nothing out if he'd not managed to succeed in securing reforms. But those reforms, meagre as they were based mainly on pull factors for migration and avoiding deeper integration. Now, he and the Remain campaign are going as far to say, as we've heard, that it might be risking a war if we voted to leave. Is that really what this debate has been reduced to? Cheap holidays or war? Now, I was pleased to see today that the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has taken a more measured view in this area on his decision. He's worked through the possible effects on our foreign policy of two positive options in a report agreed unanimously by his committee before he came to his decision in favour of Brexit just today. Yeah, please.
Foreign Affairs Committee done extraordinarily well. But has he seen the report and the article in today's Telegraph by the distinguished chairman of the Defence Committee, which comes out very strongly indeed and says what the Prime Minister is talking about with regard to war is complete and utter nonsense? Surely the chair of the Defence Committee must know better than the Prime Minister.
Of course he does.
Absolutely. Well, I'll leave the honourable gentleman to be the judge of that, but there's nothing in this leaflet about the actual options available to voters. A UK able to take its own democratic decisions on EU, emboldened by our thumbs up to further integration. The Five Presidents report. Yeah, please.
Thank you for giving way. Can I recognise I used mine to light my fire on a very cold Yorkshire night, and it was a thoroughly useful use of taxpayers' money. But isn't there a more important point on this, that actually if we vote to remain in by a very small margin, say less than the Scottish referendum, a large part of the electorate, including many in my constituency, will feel that the result has been fiddled precisely because of this wasted document we've all been provided with?
Well, this is something I really hope that we don't want to get to. I am one for, as have all of my intake, the 2015 intake, we've all signed a letter, no matter what side of the debate we stand, to say, come the 24th of June, of July even, we will actually be, come together and abide by the results because we have a government to support, we have a country to help run, and we have difficult decisions to continue to make. And so it's important that we do come together. So we do not want to see anything that can push people's opinion towards a sense of unfair treatment on one side or another. So it's a point very well made. The Five Presidents report, as I say, that's already been set out, published, has actually started to show the direction of travel should we vote to remain. It sets out plans for fiscal and political union, further pooling of decision-making on national budgets and harmonisation of insolvency law, company law, property rights and social security systems. It made it clear that these were to be pursued as single market measures applying to all 28 states. The Governor of the Bank of England admits there are risks of remaining in the European Union, in particular in relation to the development of the euro area. But we've been roped into bailout packages before, despite assurances that this would no longer happen. The latest guarantee, I'm afraid, is no better. The FT reports that it's seen the German draft white paper pushing for progress towards a European army. This was due to emerge in June, but now it's being held back until July. Make no mistake, should we vote to remain, the European club will not be the same as the one we're already in for very long. The EU budget relentlessly increases. Only last month, Jean-Claude Juncker told my honourable friend, the member for Rochester and Strood, that he didn't have to answer to her when she asked him what he was doing to bear down on the EU budget at a time when member states were having to do just that. Now, that's not the answer of a man who cares much about greater accountability. That's the view of a man who just wants to be left alone, to get on with the project without interference from irritating ingrates. Voting to stay in is not the same as voting to stay put. Now, the body of the text in the leaflet, despite having positive headlines on each page, suggests the only way is Europe, that we're stuffed if we leave, in a number of ways. Some are implied, such as the thought that many jobs may be lost, but via the dubious claim that 3 million jobs are linked to the EU, a link that the academic on whose study that was based described as pure Goebbels. Now, that link, by the way, first came in the year 2000, around that sort of time, as a reason why we should join the euro. Some claims are more direct but simplistic and with little merit, such as the EU abolishing roaming charges. Now, I can either wait until next year to use my EE phone in the EU at the same time, the same rate as I pay in the UK, or I can use my phone, my other phone, which is on the 3 network, to travel today to EU countries, as well as Hong Kong, Indonesia, Israel, Macau, New Zealand, Norway, Sri Lanka, Switzerland, and the USA, with absolutely no roaming charges already. Now, I don't have to wait for the EU to catch up with me. It's another way that the free market is far more agile than an unwieldy 1950s political project, which is representing a smaller proportion of global trade over time as the rest of the world overtakes, despite the number of states in the EU tripling since we first joined. The economy of every continent has grown over the last decade, except the Antarctica and Europe. So it's baffling that we should actually shackle ourselves to a political project and a limited vision to continue being a regional power, rather than looking further, using our attributes to be a global trading nation. Why are we paying to be a member of the world's only stagnant customs union? The leaflet claims that as the UK isn't part of the EU's border-free zone, we control our own borders. Well, we can certainly check passports at our border, and we can refuse entry to those without any valid identity documents. But that is not the same as saying that we can refuse anyone from other EU countries if they do have valid documents. And it's certainly not the same as saying that we can control immigration. I will.
A recent answer to a question that I had on how many people were turned away, it seems 20 times more applicants to come to this country are turned away from non-EU countries than EU countries. So actually it shows that unless they're particularly criminal outside the EU, that actually we only have very cursory checks and very cursory ability to stop them coming in.
My honourable friend makes a very good point. Now, my father was born in Burma. I've seen the good side of immigration, but mass, uncontrolled immigration has a major effect on our infrastructure and public services, the NHS, housing, school places. We can't tackle this effectively with one arm tied behind our back. Even the Treasury report uses the assumption that the government fails in its policy commitment to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands, not just this year, but every year until 2030. That's not why I stood last year. That's not the platform that I started last year when immigration was such a huge issue on the doorstep in Sutton and Cheam, as was around many parts of the country. The equivalent of the population of a city the size of Newcastle comes to the UK from the EU each year. Now, apart from the obvious lack of ability to control those numbers, they come in front of the queue from migrants outside the EU, who may have more suitable qualifications and skills that we actually need in this country, or desire in this country. Now, we've heard a little bit, my honourable lady mentioned about the 1975 leaflets. Page 11 of one of the leaflets in 1975, produced for the original 1975 referendum, claimed no important new policy can be decided in Brussels or anywhere else without the consent of a British minister answerable to a British government and British Parliament. Well, something's changed, hasn't it, really, over the last few years? The reality, 41 years later, is that 65% of our laws, regulations and directives come from Brussels. The emergency brake on migration benefits isn't applied by the UK, it's applied by Brussels. The red card system, as I said, held up as a meaningful renegotiation success, actually raises the bar in order to veto EU legislation compared to the current orange card of the Lisbon Treaty. Contributions to Eurozone bailouts are still a threat, despite assurances to the contrary, as we've seen before. And we're contributing financially towards Turkey's pre-accession assistance, despite assurances that they won't be members anytime soon. Well, enough is enough. We're the 5th largest economy. We have the 4th largest army. We speak the language of business. We have the ideal geographic location for world trade. We have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Yes, there are risks on either side, but I'm confident that we are big enough, bold enough, and entrepreneurial enough as a nation to manage that risk and to thrive if we vote to leave. Now, that vote to leave is a vote to take control, to bring decisions making back to accountable people here in the UK, and to decide how we spend up to £350 million per week here in the UK on the NHS, schools, housing, and other vital services. It's that positive vision that I'll be sharing with people. I can perfectly understand the anger and frustration of the petitioners who see their money, taxpayers' money, as I said, not government money, spent on propaganda. Even some Remainers are quietly dismayed and uncomfortable by this move. I hope that the circling establishment led by the government will cut the hyperbole and exaggerated claims.
Well, my honourable friend, allow me.
Oh, well.
He
He mentioned the 1975 referendum, but there is a cautionary tale in that, because in 1974, 36% of the population told pollsters they were opposed to our membership of the then common market. The government and the equivalent of the Remain campaign outvoted the Leavers by 10-1, with lies, innuendos, supposition. So there is a cautionary tale there, and I think that we should be very beware, and the government should be aware, that they can outvote us 10-1, but there will be a tremendous sense of grievance about it.
This is a grievance, as my honourable friend has outlined, that has lasted for many for 41 years, and it's something that actually we do want to avoid at all costs, to make sure that the decision that British people take is taken freely and fairly, and with as much information as fair and unbiased information, impartial information as possible, as well as listening to the two campaign groups as well. But it's important that they don't continue to stack the decks in a vital constitutional question like this, which is going to have long-term consequences far beyond the career of any of us in this room. That's why the question has rightly been put to the British people in a referendum. Now let's make our cases fairly and freely and trust the people of Britain to make the right decision. Thank you.